And for more on this, we are now joined by Thoko Madonko. She's a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University to discuss this a bit more further. Now, Thoko, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. Now, looking at that World Inequality Report, I mean, it also just tells you that at least 10% of the world's richest account for at least 3/4 of personal wealth in the country. What is your reaction to the latest figures?
So I think it's extremely important that reports like this get published and published regularly. And we saw that we had our own G20 Inequality Report expert panel that put out a report on inequality for the G20 process, and again focused a little bit on South Africa, but globally under Professor Stiglitz. And the reality is that in the same way that we think about climate change and we have the independent panel on climate change, we need to have the same kind of independent panel on inequality now that sees inequality and the impact of inequality on gender, on climate, on race, on class, as a political choice. So these are political choices that governments are making that are exacerbating these extreme divides between the super wealthy and the very poor.
And let's bring it back home. I mean, looking at this report even a bit more further, it also then just shows you that 10% of South Africa's riches also account for at least 86% of the country's wealth. I mean, that's a major concern.
And it's a concern because it hasn't shifted. And in fact, it's become worse. It's almost been entrenched. And it's been entrenched because there are policy choices that have been made since 1994 in terms of our macroeconomic policy, in particular our budget policies, our fiscal policy, our monetary policy, the inflation targeting, and so forth, has all affected our ability to tackle the kind of elements of what would make a more progressive, redistributive, economic system in which we tax extreme wealth fairly, in which we redistribute resources through the public sector, so providing public services like health, education, subsidizing water, energy, public transport, all the things that require poor households to function and thrive so that they're affordable and they can do it without being thrown into poverty because they can't afford it. The other thing is that it also, for the South African context, we should be focusing all our energy on a coherent industrial policy that looks at how we create jobs. Because our crisis right now is that we have this high unemployment, this high levels of inequality, and we're just not moving the dial on it at all. And this report now is showing that things are actually getting worse. Even though the speaker in the little insert said that in terms of race inequality, things have shifted, what he's not telling you is that that's a very small proportion of a huge divide of 10% versus 86% of the wealth. Is just it's unsustainable, and it's unsustainable from a climate perspective. It's unsustainable from a social reproduction, so the ability to take care of each other, and from a political democracy perspective. It threatens our democracy. So inequality is not something to sort of say, let's just focus on poverty rather than wealth, which is often a comment that gets given, like, no, let's focus on poverty and don't worry about the wealthy. The reality is they are wealthy because people are poor. There is a direct relationship between poor people and rich people, and we need to narrow that gap, and the report points to the ways in which that can be done.
Yeah, and let's talk then about where it seems as if we are going wrong as a country. I mean, earlier on, you touched on issues around policy. I mean, we always hear this, particularly from the likes of the ANC, and they've been in power for quite some time. I mean, they have the likes of policy conference, and then that, in a way, finds itself within the policies of the country. So where does it seem that we are going wrong? Because it doesn't seem that the needle has shifted much since 1994.
So what we have policy incoherence, and some would argue that, in fact, we have a level of talking left, walking right. So we have this paradox of this huge infrastructure in place in terms of our grant system, which is absolutely necessary, and in fact, improves our scores, because if people did not receive grants in this country, the inequality levels would be, off the charts. So the grants play an incredible role in alleviating poverty in South Africa and alleviating, to a certain extent, certain amounts of inequality. But what we're not seeing is where we say that we prioritize public services. So my area of speciality is looking at public finances, and year upon year, we institute austerity budgets, which is budget cuts. We are cutting the budgets to education, to health, to housing, to public transport, to the very things that make life affordable. So we have this cost of living crisis that makes it unaffordable to live in South Africa meaningfully. And then on top of that, we cut taxes. So since 1994, we have reduced corporate income tax. We have reduced the tax on the high net wealth individuals. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about your average South African. I'm talking about extremely wealthy individuals who can afford to pay their fair share in taxes. And we need a global minimum on this to support South Africa's policy to be able to tax wealth. Treasury has come out to say that there's no room to tax wealth. It's simply not true. We can tax wealth, we can tax assets. It's just political will that's getting in the way. And those resources are not being redirected back where they're needed to make sure that we have safe and healthy and well-resourced communities. And so the levels of violence, gender-based violence, get exacerbated because we're not prepared to make some hard decisions on the basis of what the super wealthy do when they're buying yachts and airplanes and skewing the kind of economic system that we have. And so it's absolutely critical that we relook at our budget. So come February, March next year, we should really scrutinize our budget to make sure that this is one about redistribution and one that is focused on employment.
All right, Thoko, thank you so much for your time, ma'am. That's Thoko Madonko there. She's a researcher at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. They're just giving us her brief outlook when it comes to the World Inequality Report 2026. Certainly a bleak picture being painted across the world.